You have to understand the medieval world to get why people cared so much about relics. Life was often short. It was brutal. Disease, famine, and war were constants. The line between this world and the next felt very thin. And the next world was everything. Your eternal salvation was the most important project of your life. In this world, God felt very distant. He was an all-powerful judge. Christ was a celestial king. But the saints were different. Saints were people who had lived on earth. They had struggled just like you. They had faced temptation. They had died, often horribly, for their faith. But now they were in heaven, sitting right next to God. They were your advocates, your friends in the highest of courts. You could pray to a saint, and they would put in a good word for you. But how do you make that connection stronger? How do you get a saint's attention? This is where relics came in. A relic was a physical piece of that holiness left on earth. It wasn't just a symbol. It wasn't just a reminder. People believed the relic contained a divine power, a spiritual energy called Virtus. This power could heal the sick, protect a city from invaders, or guarantee a good harvest. It was a direct, tangible link to the divine. Imagine you're a peasant with a sick child. The local doctor, if you even have one, has no real medicine. Your prayers feel like whispers in a hurricane. But the church in the next town has a finger bone of St. Stephen. People say miracles happen there. So you walk for 2 days, carrying your child, you arrive at the church and see the bone, maybe encased in a beautiful gold box. You get close to it, you pray with everything you have, you feel the presence of the saint, a conduit of God's power, right there in the room with you. It's a tangible source of hope in a world that offered very little. This belief was not just for the poor. It was for everyone. Kings and emperors were desperate for relics. A powerful relic in your capital city was like having a spiritual nuclear weapon. It proved God favored you and your kingdom. It legitimized your rule. It brought prestige. When Charlemagne built his great capital at Aachen, he filled its chapel with some of the most powerful relics in Christendom, including what was believed to be the swaddling clothes of the infant Jesus. This wasn't just about personal piety. It was a statement of power. He was building a new Rome, a new Jerusalem, and he needed the spiritual hardware to back it up. So relic hunting wasn't a hobby. It was a fundamental pursuit. It was driven by faith, fear, politics, and power. It was about making the supernatural tangible. In a world of uncertainty, a saint's bone was something real. You could see it, you could sometimes touch it, you could be in its presence. It was a piece of heaven on earth, and people would do almost anything to get one. This created a huge demand. Every new church wanted a relic for its altar. Every city wanted a patron saint to protect it. Every king wanted a divine seal of approval for his dynasty, and there were only so many original apostles and famous martyrs to go around. This scarcity, combined with an insatiable spiritual hunger, set the stage for a strange and often violent market. It drove a centuries-long treasure hunt across Europe and the Middle East, a search for the physical remains of holiness. The hunt would involve pious quests, back-alley deals, outright theft, and even the clash of armies. All for a piece of bone, a scrap of cloth, or a splinter of wood. So what were people actually looking for? What counted as a relic? There was a clear hierarchy, a kind of ranking system for the holy. The most valuable, the top-tier items, were what we call first-class relics. These were parts of a saint's body. A piece of bone, a lock of hair, a tooth, or even vials of their blood. These were considered the most potent because they were the saint himself in a physical sense. The body of a saint was not just a corpse. It was a vessel that had been filled with the Holy Spirit. It was destined to be resurrected on Judgment Day. So, possessing a piece of it was possessing a direct connection to that saint's power. The most famous examples are legendary. The head of John the Baptist was one of the most sought-after relics in all of Christianity. The problem was, several churches claimed to have it, including one in Rome, one in Amiens, and the Umayyad Mosque in Damascus. This didn't seem to bother people too much. Faith had a way of smoothing over logical problems. Maybe the saint had more than one head in a spiritual sense, or maybe only one was the real one, and yours was it. The bones of St. Peter, the rock upon which the church was built, were the ultimate prize for Rome, cementing its authority over all other churches. Below the body parts were the second-class relics. These were items that the saint had owned or frequently used. The most common examples were pieces of their clothing, a tunic, a cloak, or a pair of sandals. But it could also be a book they wrote, the cup they drank from, or, in the case of a martyr, the instrument of their death. The chains that held St. Peter in prison were a hugely important relic in Rome. The seamless robe of Christ, for which the Roman soldiers cast lots at the crucifixion, was another relic of immense power. And these items were holy because of their intimate contact with the saint. The saint's virtus had soaked into them. They were less potent than a piece of the body, but still incredibly valuable. Finally, you had third-class relics. These were things that had touched a first-class relic. This category could be almost infinite. A piece of cloth that you pressed against the tomb of a saint became a third-class relic. A bit of dust swept from the floor of the crypt was a relic. Oil from a lamp that burned before a saint's shrine was a relic. This was the most accessible type. Pilgrims could travel to a shrine and create their own third-class relics to take home. They would buy small metal flasks called ampullae and fill them with water or oil that had touched the tomb. This allowed the power of the saint to be distributed far and wide. It was a way for ordinary people to bring a tiny spark of that holiness back to their own village. Of course, some relics defied easy categorization. These were the relics associated directly with Jesus Christ himself. They were in a class of their own. The most famous was the true cross. According to legend, the cross on which Jesus was crucified was discovered in Jerusalem in the 4th century by Helena, the mother of the Emperor Constantine. She supposedly brought large portions of it back to Roman Constantinople. From there, for centuries, tiny splinters of the cross were distributed across Europe as the ultimate diplomatic gift. By the late Middle Ages, the Protestant reformer John Calvin famously joked that there were enough pieces of the true cross in European churches to build a large ship. Then there was the Crown of Thorns. This was kept in Constantinople for centuries, the prize of the Byzantine emperors. But in the 13th century, the empire was broke. The emperor sold the crown to King Louis IX of France to pay his debts. Louis saw this as the greatest acquisition of his life. He built a breathtaking chapel in Paris, the Sainte-Chapelle, to house it. It was essentially a massive jewel box reliquary made of stained glass. The variety of relics was staggering. Milk from the Virgin Mary, the baby teeth of Jesus, the last breath of Joseph preserved in a bottle. To the modern mind, it sounds absurd, but to the medieval mind, these objects were not just curiosities. They were physical proof of the stories of the Bible. They made faith real. The world was full of divine power, and it could be found in the most unexpected things. This belief fueled the hunt, sending men and women on dangerous journeys, inspiring them to build magnificent cathedrals, and sometimes driving them to commit terrible crimes. Not all relic hunting was a desperate scramble of theft and fraud. There were official channels, respectable ways that holy relics moved from one place to another. These methods were wrapped in ceremony and law, turning the transfer of a bone into a major political and religious event. The most high-status method was the gift. A relic was the ultimate present. It cost more than gold and was more valuable than land. Kings and popes traded relics to seal alliances, to say thank you, or to ask for a favor. When a Byzantine emperor wanted to improve relations with a Western king, he wouldn't send a chest of coins. He might send a tiny piece of the true cross or the finger of an obscure apostle. This was a gesture of immense respect. It showed that the recipient was worthy of housing such a holy object. The gift created a spiritual bond between the two leaders and their kingdoms. Relics were also purchased. This was a bit of a gray area. The church officially frowned on simony, the buying and selling of spiritual things. But in practice, a massive market for relics existed. Rome was a major center for this trade. For centuries, pilgrims and church officials flocked to the catacombs, the ancient underground burial tunnels, which were believed to be full of the bodies of early Christian martyrs. You could, for a price, acquire the body of a saint, complete with a story of their martyrdom, often invented on the spot by the seller. Constantinople was the other great marketplace. The capital of the Byzantine Empire was a treasure house of relics gathered over 1,000 years. When Western churchmen or nobles visited, they often went shopping. Sometimes this was framed not as a purchase, but as a donation to the church that owned the relic, with the relic given as a gift in return. It was a way to get around the rules. Money changed hands, and a holy bone would begin its journey west. But the grandest and most celebrated form of relic acquisition was the translation. This was the official, ceremonial moving of a saint's body, or part of it, from one place to another. Usually, this happened when a new, grander church was built to honor the saint. A translation was a huge public event, a combination of a religious festival and a royal parade. First, the saint's old tomb would be opened. This was a moment of high drama. Bishops and abbots would gather, praying and fasting. A good sign was the odor of sanctity, a sweet perfume-like smell that was said to emanate from the bones of the truly holy. This was proof that the saint approved of the move. The bones would be carefully cleaned and wrapped in precious silk. Then came the procession. The relic, now housed in a temporary casket, would be carried through the streets to its new home. Everyone would turn out. The nobility, the clergy, the common folk. It was a day off work, a time of celebration. People would line the streets, hoping to get close enough to be blessed by the relic's power. Once it reached the new church, there would be a long solemn mass. The relic would be placed in its new shrine, a magnificent reliquary that might have taken years for goldsmiths to create. Feasting and celebration would often last for days. A translation announced to the world that your church, your city, had arrived. The translation of St. Cuthbert's remains to Durham Cathedral in England was a foundational event for the power of the Prince Bishops of Durham. The translation of St. Mark's body to Venice, a story we'll get to later, established that city as a major player on the world stage. This process also served another purpose: verification. By publicly moving and re-enshrining a relic with the full authority of the church, you were declaring it to be authentic. You were creating an official history for the object, a chain of custody. It separated your prized relic from the questionable bones being sold in some back alley in Rome. Of course, the origin story of the relic might still be a complete fabrication, but the translation ceremony itself gave it a stamp of legitimacy. It was a piece of religious theater that turned a simple object into a source of immense power and pride. These formal, organized journeys were the clean, respectable face of relic hunting. They hid the much messier reality that often lay behind a relic's long and winding story. The respectable world of gifts and ceremonies was only half the story. The other half was dark, violent, and full of deception. The demand for relics was so high that it created a brutal black market, where theft, fraud, and conquest were common ways to acquire a piece of a saint. The most fascinating aspect of this was the idea of pious theft, or furta sacra. This was a special category of stealing, and it came with a clever justification. Imagine you are a monk in a small, unimportant monastery. A few towns over, a church has the body of a powerful saint, but you feel they don't appreciate it. Their church is small, their monks are not very devout. Surely the saint would be happier and could perform more miracles at your monastery, where she would be properly honored. So you and a few of your brethren go in the middle of the night, break into the other church, pry open the tomb, and steal the body. This is a crime, but here's the twist: on the way back to your monastery, a miracle happens. A blind man in your group suddenly regains his sight. A lame woman who touches the casket begins to walk. This was seen as proof. The saint wanted to be moved. She approved of the theft. The miracles were her way of saying, "Thank you for rescuing me." The crime was instantly transformed into a holy mission. One of the most famous stories of pious theft involves the body of Saint Foy, a young girl martyred by the Romans. Her relics were kept in the town of Agen in France. The monks of the nearby monastery of Conques were intensely jealous, and they wanted her power for themselves. So, one of the Conques monks went undercover. He joined the monastery at Agen and lived there as a loyal monk for 10 years, earning everyone's trust until he was eventually made the guardian of the shrine. One night he stole the relics and escaped back to Conques. The monks of Conques celebrated. They built a magnificent new church for Saint Foy, and soon miracles started happening. Pilgrims flocked to Conques, making the monastery rich and famous. The theft was a complete success, retroactively justified by the saint's apparent approval. Alongside theft was outright fraud. For every genuine relic, there were probably a dozen fakes. It was an industry. Unscrupulous traders would gather old bones from graveyards or animal bones from butcher shops, put them in a nice box, and invent a compelling story about a long-lost martyr. It was almost impossible to prove them wrong. Who could say for sure that this wasn't the shin bone of St. Pancras? Faith was expected to fill in the gaps. Some churchmen grew skeptical. Guibert of Nogent, a French abbot in the 12th century, wrote a whole treatise complaining about it. He told the story of a shrine that claimed to have one of Jesus' baby teeth. He found it ridiculous and blasphemous. But such voices of doubt were rare. Most people wanted to believe. The promise of a miracle was too powerful to be questioned. The biggest and most violent transfer of relics, however, came through war. The Crusades were a massive catalyst. When Crusaders went to the Holy Land, they weren't just fighting for territory. They were on a mission to reclaim the lands where Christ had walked. And they brought back souvenirs. They came back with pieces of the true cross, stones from holy sites, and the bodies of saints they discovered or looted along the way. The greatest single haul of relics came from the Fourth Crusade in 1204. This crusade went horribly wrong. Instead of fighting Muslims in the Holy Land, the Western Crusaders ended up attacking and sacking the Christian city of Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire. For 3 days, the Crusaders pillaged the city, which was the world's greatest repository of holy relics. They stripped the church of their treasures. The knights and clergy who led the crusade grabbed the most famous relics, the Crown of Thorns, the holy lance that pierced Christ's side, the Shroud of Turin. The Venetian fleet that carried the Crusaders took their payment in relics, most famously the 4 bronze horses that now stand on St. Mark's Basilica. The body of St. Mark himself had been stolen from Alexandria in Egypt by Venetian merchants centuries earlier, hidden in a barrel of pork to get past Muslim guards. The sack of Constantinople was just the culmination of this opportunistic mindset. This single event flooded Western Europe with a new wave of top-tier relics. Cathedrals in France, Germany, and Italy suddenly found themselves in possession of objects they could have only dreamed of before. The violence of the conquest was quickly forgotten. The church leaders who received these looted relics saw it as a sign of God's favor. God had allowed Constantinople to fall, they argued, so that these precious relics could be moved to the West where they would be more properly venerated. It was the ultimate justification, turning an act of brutal imperial conquest into another chapter of holy history. Getting the relic was only the beginning. Once a church or a kingdom had its prize, the next step was to house it, display it, and use its power. This process transformed art, architecture, and the entire economy of Europe. First, the relic needed a home. You couldn't just leave a saint's finger on a shelf. It required a special container called a reliquary. The reliquaries were not simple boxes. They were some of the most spectacular works of art created in the Middle Ages. Goldsmiths, jewelers, and enamel workers poured their greatest skills into them. They were made of gold, silver, ivory, and covered in precious gems. The shape of the reliquary often reflected what was inside. An arm bone would be placed in a reliquary shaped like a golden arm. A piece of a skull would go into a beautiful golden head. This wasn't meant to be morbid. It was a way of honoring the saint and making the invisible relic visible to the faithful. The reliquary's beauty was a reflection of the spiritual value of what it contained. It was a physical testament to the power and glory of the saint. The Sainte-Chapelle in Paris, built for the Crown of Thorns, was perhaps the ultimate reliquary, an entire building designed to be a heavenly setting for one perfect object. Once the relic was housed, it became an engine of economic activity. A church with a powerful, miracle-working relic became a major destination. This was the age of pilgrimage. People would travel hundreds, even thousands of miles on foot to visit these shrines. Journeys were long, dangerous, and expensive, but the spiritual reward was considered worth it. A pilgrimage could be done as a penance for sins, to ask for a miracle, or simply to get closer to God. Great pilgrimage roads crisscrossed Europe, all leading to major shrines. The most famous were the roads to Rome to visit the tombs of Peter and Paul, to the Holy Land, and to Santiago de Compostela in Spain, which held the body of St. James. But there were hundreds of smaller regional sites. Canterbury in England became a massive pilgrimage destination after the Archbishop Thomas Becket was murdered in his own cathedral in 1170. And his tomb quickly became associated with healing miracles, and the flow of pilgrims made the cathedral incredibly wealthy. An entire industry grew up around these pilgrims. Towns with major relics became bustling tourist centers. And inns and taverns were built to house the travelers. Merchants sold food and supplies. And, most importantly, there was a thriving market for souvenirs. Pilgrims wanted proof they had completed their journey. They would buy small metal badges that could be sewn onto their hats, bearing the symbol of the saint. At the shrine itself, they would buy small flasks to fill with holy water or oil that had come into contact with the relic, creating their own third-class relics to take home. This economy reshaped the map of Europe, turning small, out-of-the-way towns into prosperous hubs of international travel. The relic also became the heart of a community's identity. The saint was the town's protector, its patron. The saint's feast day would be the biggest holiday of the year, celebrated with processions, fairs, and religious services. The relic was brought out of the church and carried through the streets to bless the people, the fields, and the city walls. It was a source of immense civic pride. To insult a town's saint was to insult the entire town. This intense era of relic veneration eventually began to fade. The Protestant Reformation in the 16th century was a major turning point. The reformers, like Martin Luther and John Calvin, saw the whole practice as a form of idolatry and superstition. They mocked the belief that a dead person's bone could have any power. For them, faith alone was what mattered, not physical objects. In Protestant countries, there was a wave of iconoclasm. Shrines were destroyed, reliquaries were melted down for their gold and silver, and the relics themselves were burned or thrown away. The Catholic Church responded with a Counter-Reformation. At the Council of Trent, they reaffirmed that venerating relics was a legitimate practice, but they tried to clean it up. They put in stricter rules for authenticating relics and condemned the selling of them. The Age of Frantic. Anything goes relic hunting was over, but the legacy remains. The great cathedrals of Europe, many of them built to house a specific relic, still stand. The art, the stories, and the pilgrim roads are all part of the fabric of history. It can be hard for us to grasp the mindset that drove people to steal a corpse and call it holy, or to spend a fortune on a splinter of wood. But for centuries, these objects were the focal point of faith, power, and hope. They were a way of touching heaven in a world that was often hellish. They were a direct line to the divine, and in the end, that was a connection worth almost any price.